Okay, class, welcome to part 2 of chapter 7, dealing with commerce and culture from 500 to 1500. This part will deal with the sea roads and mainly the Indian Ocean trade. You can find this section in your textbook from pages 324 to 337. One thing that we see about the sea exchange is, just like we talk about, it's mostly going to be over water. The history of sea travel goes back to the early Roman and Greek time period. We started somewhere in the Mediterranean. We're not going to see anything new. Everything begins with the Mediterranean sea trade. If you look at the map, you see we talk about ancient Rome, the Roman Empire, which pretty much took up all of this territory. A lot of sea trade was going on in this territory here. The Persians, the Greeks, all, when they controlled this territory, they controlled pretty much the Mediterranean sea trade. So you see some of the participants, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And this Italian city of Venice in this territory was really the major center of trade during this time period. Also, sea exchange or sea trade took place around the Red Sea area. Your participants were the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Africans. Now, you see that in both the Mediterranean and the Red Sea because if you remember, especially the Greeks and the Romans, they expanded their empire into Egypt, and when they did that, they took over that trade. The major port was Alexandria, which you see right here on the map, and they pretty much connected the Mediterranean sea trade along with the Red Sea trade. So sea trade was not new during this time period. It had taken place, but it just not had become a global player in the trading networks. Then we bring in the Indian Ocean trade. Now, the Indian Ocean trade, or exchange as you might call it, if you look at the map, it shows in red the trade routes. You see a numerous amount of trade routes going all the way from China as they come through and into South Asia, and then moving on over into Africa and all of these different ports and everything. When you see these blue lines, and we'll talk about the monsoons and everything like that, and how these monsoons played a major role in how sea trade took place, you'll see how that works. If you think about it, you couldn't move from one area to another without the help of the monsoons. But like I said, we'll talk about that as we go through this PowerPoint. So just like the Silk Roads, there were certain reasons why the Indian Ocean trade grew. First thing being environmental and cultural diversities in each region, meaning that you had to have certain situations that took place to be able to move from one place to another. These cultural diversities made it intriguing to others who were outside of those regions. And so they wanted to kind of get together and talk about certain goods, ideas, things like that. And also there was a desire for goods that were not available in the region that they were in. Just like the Silk Road. You know, you didn't have the silk in the West and you wanted it, so you had to find a trader or some vendor to take it from the East to the West. And so there was a desire from on both ways. A lot of the same goods were traded as they were on the Silk Roads. For example, the silk and the porcelain from China, people wanted it back in the East and back in the West, I'm sorry, in the Mediterranean region. So it was one way of getting it from one place to the other. Also, the ivory and the gold from the African coast was wanted in the East. So now you have something that's wanted in the East that the people in the West have. One thing that was different from the Silk Roads was the transportation was much lower as far as costs were concerned. It didn't take as much money to get things over the waterways as it did across the land. Also, ships could carry much more at one time than camels did. You had big cargo holds in which you could place a lot more goods in a ship than what you could on a caravan of camels. And then Another difference, we talked about the Silk Roads taking luxury goods. Well, the sea roads not only carried luxury items, but they carried bulk staple goods, the things, everyday types of things that people needed. They could transport them from one area to another a lot easier. Now, those monsoon winds that we talked about earlier, this is what really made the Indian Ocean change possible. And we know that a monsoon is a wind that has alternating currents. It makes the currents blow from one way to another. A lot of boats at this time had sails, so they wanted you wanted to catch the wind in those sails to help you move from one place to another. So they were predictable winds. They blew predictably eastward in the summer months and blew predictably westward in the winter months. So if you were moving from, say, for example, China going over to Africa, you would always want to go in the winter months. And then you would stay there until the summer months came along, and then you could move back. You'd have wind aid to move you back to the next area, going back to where you came from. So some merchants, they left one area, they stayed there for a few months, and then they waited for the winds to change before they would take their shipments back the other direction. So if we think about the Indian Ocean Exchange, you got to think about it globally. It was not really between countries. It was not really between regions. The one thing that it was between individual merchant towns. So these travelers would go, if you see on the map here, you see the different areas. All of these ports were the main stopping points for that trade route. So it wasn't, like going from China to Africa or China to India. You were going from Canton to maybe Mogadishu, or you were going from Kilwa over to Borneo. So those were the ports that they were trying to get to be able to do what they needed to do. Now, how did the trade grow? There were two major transformations that took place between 500 and 1500 that led to the major growth of this Indian trade network. One, the economic and political revival of China. After the Han Dynasty collapsed, remember, it went into another time of chaos, not a whole bunch of, it was defragmentation. And so after a certain time period, China kind of revived itself. And then secondly, this new religion of Islam came about in the 7th century. And it played a major role in the growth of the network. So when we think about China's comeback, this took place 4 centuries after the collapse of the Han Dynasty. So we're thinking right around 500-600 CE. There was a reestablishment of a unified government, and this government encouraged sea trade, and they believed in economic growth. So they wanted their Chinese products to pour into those trade networks that would bring a lot of economic gains back to China. And then lastly, they had a lot of technological innovations. For example, they were able to build larger ships. They were able to, they invented the magnetic compass to be able to guide them in the areas that they needed to go to. So we see that China starts to reinvent or re-establish itself as a major player in the world. And then we talked about the rise of Islam. Islam, the merchants were treated a little bit differently in Islam than they were in China. We talked about in the last unit how merchants were on the lowest part of the social ladder. Well, in contrast to that, in Islam, merchants were believed to be one of the higher type of people on the social ladder. And so it was really friendly to commercial life. You had the creation of an Arab empire. As you see on the map, you see how large, when the Muslims took over, and we'll talk about the Muslims in a future chapter, but you'll see how large this empire became, and they were able to control not only the Mediterranean, but the Red Sea, and then this Indian Ocean trade, as you see over here. This empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to India. Like I said, it brought a wide range of economies to a single political system, and it was a powerful and wealthy empire. And after the Indian Ocean trade started, it continued to stimulate that trade. So they had a lot of Islamic or Muslim traders in this trade network. One thing about the Indian Ocean, it transformed all of its participants in one way or another. So you have two major transformations in two certain regions.
Southeast Asia, and in East Africa. Both regions experienced political change, with the rulers using wealth to construct their larger states, and also it promoted cultural change and exposed people to new regions. If you look at the map here, this is the Southeast Asian region where a lot of the trade took place, and we haven't talked about these lower areas yet, but they become a major player in the trade network. And then also the east coast of Africa. You're going to see all of these port cities become major players in this trade network also, where you're going to see wealth and everything go into these areas. And as we get to talk about Africa in this time period, you'll see how trade affected some of those states. So when we talk about Southeast Asia and Srivijaya, Southeast Asia between India and China, as you see the map, you see it right here. It allowed it to play an important role in Indian Ocean commerce. So in the year 350 CE, you had Malay sailors open up all water sea route between India and China in the Straits of Malacca. So you know you had goods coming from this area. To be able to get to Africa or to India, they had to go through the South China Sea. And all of these territories became port cities to where a lot of sailors came in to rest, or they came in to trade. Different things were happening, and so they could move on into the other territories. And then the result of this was more traders and travelers coming into the region, like we talked about, and the ports along these peninsulas competing to attract these traders that came in. So from this competition in the Malay Kingdom came Srivijaya. They dominated the region in the Indian Ocean with commerce from 670 to 1025. The biggest advantages that they had was they had a big supply of gold. They had access to in-demand spices. If you think about the map, those were the spice islands that all through from China over to India. And then they were able to place taxes on passing ships. So they were able to make money off of this Indian Ocean trade. They were influenced by Indian traders and adopted Buddhism. These rulers sponsored the creation of images of the Buddha. So not only did Buddhism move from India to China, but it also moved into those areas in Srivijaya. They became a center of Buddhist learning and culture. Then you have the Sailendra Kingdom. This is another kingdom in Southeast Asia that was influenced by Indian culture. They built huge Hindu temples and Buddhist monuments. So they had both Hinduism and Buddhism that came into their territory. The largest Buddhist monument anywhere in the world is located in this territory, Borobudur. So you see the Sailendra territory here. This is the temple at Borobudur, mountain-shaped structure. It had 10 levels, elaborate carvings and illustrations, and it had a 3-mile-long walkway. Also in East Africa and Swahili, the Swahili civilization set of commercial city-states stretching along the East African coast, as you see throughout this area right here. Each state was politically independent with its own king. You had a big competition for that trade between each one of those city-states because money was involved, and everybody wanted to try and make that money. You had sharp class distinctions in each city-state, which was a big gap between the merchant elite class and the commoners, the haves and the have-nots. Remember, we talked about in Africa, those people who were merchants at this time now were on the upper class, unlike being in China. You had cultural change in the Swahili. Arab, Indian, and Persian merchants were always welcome in that area. And the Swahili language was a blend of that African Bantu and Arabic. The Bantu came from, like we talked about in the last chapter, that migration, and then Arabic coming from the Islamic people. So the Swahili civilization quickly became Islamic. And then you have one of the travelers, Ibn Battuta. He was an Arab scholar and merchant, and he came through and he described these East African cities as Muslim societies. And so, as you'll see in your documents and how he talks about the Muslim state during this time period. Coastal cities got from the interior of Africa, then sold them to others using the Indian Ocean Trade Network. This allowed regions in the interior of Africa to become wealthy. For example, this great state of Zimbabwe. My time is running out, so this is the end of part 2. The next thing that we'll see are the sand roads in part 3.